Do you ever wonder if the anxious behavior your toddler or preschooler is exhibiting is, quote, normal? Or do you ever feel unsure of how to help empower your child when they are anxious? Well, my guest today is an anxiety and OCD therapist. She's written several books, including How to Parent Your Anxious Toddler, and provides lots of online resources to help parents with children who have anxiety and OCD. If you don't already know her, I can't wait to introduce you to my friend, Natasha Daniels. Hi, I'm Allison Egidi, a pediatric sleep and wellness coach and a mom of two. I love to help parents find solutions. This is How Long Till Bedtime. Hey, Natasha, thank you so much for joining me on the podcast.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
So, for those in my audience who don't already know who you are, could you introduce yourself?
Sure. So I am a child anxiety and OCD therapist, and I am a mom to three kids with anxiety and OCD. And so I kind of eat, live, and breathe providing resources for parents who are raising kids with anxiety and OCD online. So I do podcasts, YouTube channel. I have a community just trying to support parents to be able to support their kids directly.
Awesome. And I'm curious how this became your area of focus to specifically niche down to parents and children with anxiety and OCD.
I wrote a book, How to Parent Your Anxious Toddler, while I was doing my private practice. And so I feel like that really became kind of my narrow focus because of the book. But I actually think it's because I was an anxious child that I started to gravitate towards the anxious kids that were coming into my practice. So when I had an anxious kid, like I look forward to it, on my schedule.
Yeah.
And so eventually I was just like, you know what? All I want to see are kids with anxiety and OCD because those are my people and I really know how to help them. And then I birthed three of them actually after I did that, which, the irony in that is
Oh,
there.
so you had already niched down before you had kids.
Yes. Before I had my first child. Well, my first child was probably about two when I was an infant and toddler mental health therapist at the time. And I was in like a postgraduate program that the clinic that I worked for put me through. And I kept raising my hand, being like, well, my child does that. Isn't that normal? Aren't we pathologizing toddlers? And eventually they kind of pulled me aside and were like, you probably need to go to early intervention and have her assessed.
So interesting. And do you feel like when you were a kid that your parents knew that you had anxiety, or did you realize that hindsight?
No, nobody knew what I was going through. I was one of four, and my dad had bipolar. And so we were like, it was a very chaotic childhood. And so my issues were not seen or noticed because there was like bigger fires going on to my parents.
And do you think your background prompted you to go into this field? Or as you were in this field, you and learning about it, you realized, oh my gosh, I had anxiety and never even realized it?
I think I always knew I had anxiety. I don't think I knew I had social anxiety, that there was like a disorder that really defined my paranoia socially and was kind of the main impetus for all of my struggles. I don't think I realized it at that level until, ironically, until I was doing this online stuff, like way into my 40s, where I was like, wow, I like have acute social anxiety. Like I always thought I had general anxiety, but I didn't realize like the level of my social anxiety until I was actually providing online resources.
Crazy. We learn about ourselves all the time. And on the topic of your kids also having anxiety, I'm curious how strong is the genetic link with anxiety?
Well, there is definitely a genetic predisposition for anxiety. So even if you have other mental health issues in your family, genes like my father's bipolar, and so my parents, neither of them had anxiety. I'm still at a higher risk for anxiety, and so are my offspring. But that's not the whole piece. There's an environmental piece as well, because they've done twin studies where you don't have identical twins always 100% getting the exact same anxiety disorder. So it is an environmental and genetic combination, like a lot of things are.
Mhm. Interesting. Um, I'd love to know when you so today we wanted to really focus on toddlers with anxiety, and I'd love to know what the symptoms are of a toddler with anxiety and kind of the difference between age appropriate, separation anxiety happens from time to time, or any other age appropriate anxiety versus this should use a little bit more attention.
It is tricky when we're talking about toddlers because it is developmentally appropriate for toddlers to have some anxious behaviors. And toddlers are also really rigid, so they have a lot of inflexibility and things that we would label down the road as anxiety. So to me, some of it is just the level of severity of how is my child going through these developmental stages. Are they able to recover? Are they more rigid than the average toddler? So we're looking at that resilience and that ability to kind of pull themselves together. Meltdowns are common, but then how often are they not able to self-regulate, um, and are struggling for a longer period of time?
Mhm. One area that I have a lot of clients ask me about is daycare drop off. So when they're taking their toddler to daycare or early preschool years, and they feel like their child's really anxious about the drop off, how do you think parents should interpret that?
It's normal for a toddler to cry at drop off. I mean, some don't, but a lot of them do, and that's normal. Like, that's exactly kind of what I'm talking about. That's a developmental stage that's appropriate. Separation anxiety is actually a healthy thing. It is normal between 8 and 12 months to have separation anxiety. It's part of the process. But when you have a child who's not able to recover, normally, you have the daycare saying, after you left, 10 minutes later, they were playing and they're fine. And they try to reassure the anxious parent, don't worry, I promise you they're having a good time when you go. But the anxious child, or the child that might be predisposed to anxiety, doesn't rebound. And so again, it's that example of what is developmentally appropriate, but then the extreme of it. So they might be crying for hours and they have to call you and have you come back to the daycare, or maybe they're hiding in the corner and they're inconsolable for the period of time that they are at daycare. And you might have that for a little while. It's a new environment, but after a few weeks of getting into the routine, you should see a drop off in that behavior.
Mhm. So parents shouldn't be worried just that their child's a little upset when they leave. When they are getting that text 5 minutes later, they're happy, they're playing, you would put that in the category of totally normal.
Yeah, it's very typical. And even if they're not okay for a few days, it's a new environment. Um, Eventually they acclimate and they might just cry a drop off. And so it could be
Mhm.
rough for a few days where they're not rebounding and they are having a rough time. But after a few days, they should be okay. They should be able to rebound.
And young kids who truly are more anxious, so my oldest has anxiety, and I remember kind of early preschool age, she was acutely aware of things. That's kind of what I noticed first. So she was acutely aware of energy, of my energy. I could think a stressful thought in the car and she'd be sitting behind me. So she couldn't see my face and I wouldn't say anything. And all of a sudden she'd say, "What's wrong? Mommy, what's wrong?" So she was acutely aware. She was if we move something in the house, she would notice that it moved. Like, why did that move? And I really noticed it because my younger daughter was more typical. And so that's when I realized one of these is not like the other. And that's what brought it to my attention. And I would describe her as a very spirited child still to this day. Um, do you find that anxious children are often more acutely aware of their surroundings and of energy?
You know, there are anxious kids that aren't, but a lot of them are extra sensitive. And so they can read a room really quickly. They are picking up on your moods and your energy. They can look at your facial expression. They might be concerned when your words aren't saying anything, but your face is saying something. Or they can pick up the tension in a house where maybe you think you're hiding it pretty well. And so that is, I actually kind of call that a superpower of anxious kids. If we can teach them how to rein it in, and if we can teach them how to see it as a superpower down the road. Obviously, we're not doing that with toddlers, but I think how we frame anxiety or that sensitivity can also um, empower them or disempower them.
Ah, I like that. So tell me a little bit more of maybe some language you might use with a young child that's super in tune to everyone's energy.
Yeah, it's hard when they're toddlers because when they're toddlers, all we're really doing is observing, playing detective, honing in on my child's sensitivities. Oh, they're very sensitive to sound. A lot of anxious kids tend to have sensory issues, not always sensory processing disorder, but sometimes those are comorbid conditions. Um, so we're not talking about superpowers when they're toddlers or preschoolers even. That is something that we talk about when they're older. What we're doing when they're toddlers and preschoolers is we're starting to lay the foundation. So we're starting to give them language for the things that they're feeling. A lot of times, anxious kids are really intelligent and they're talking early and they have a bigger vocabulary. And so we're giving them bigger words and a more a more varied vocabulary to be able to express those nuances. So mom is frustrated. Like my little kids, they had like such big words. He's antagonizing me. Like they were saying that by the time they were 4, because they needed a big menu of language because they had such big emotions. And so that's what we can do at that young age is label the feelings for them. And I think sometimes we're afraid to tell a child, you're blah, 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 you're sad, you're angry. And really, our anxious kids, or kids in general at that age, they need that extra help to recognize I'm feeling, my heart is pounding and I'm starting to feel sweaty and I'm feeling shaky. I don't know what the language is for this. I just know the physical feeling. So when we see that, we give them that word. And we don't say you look like or you seem like. With toddlers, we say you are. We have to be very succinct with our speech. And you are worried. You are worried mommy's going to leave. You see the babysitter and mommy's going to leave. And that makes your body feel worried. And that's doing a lot. That seems like it's not doing a lot, but that's doing a lot.
Because you're helping them identify the sensation they have?
Yeah, you're connecting the mind and body. They're saying, okay, so when I feel this weird thing in my stomach, this is called worried. And so now, and you have to do it often, and using different words, I think can be helpful too. And then you will start to see, like at 3 or sometimes 4, depending on their verbal skills, they'll start to mirror that back. I'm worried, and like when it happens, it's just so cool because you're like, oh my gosh, like it's now their own. I'm scared, mommy, I'm scared. And so, yeah, we're planting those seeds for them to have some words because if you don't do that, you're going to see more dysregulation. You're going to see more of the meltdowns. You're going to see more of the inconsolable crying.
Interesting. So the other area that I find when I work with parents that there seem children who seem to be more anxious tend to struggle more with what I would call transitions. So I think all young children can struggle with transitions. So, but for example, watching shows, that's often a really big struggle for kids to shift away from a show. And I tend to find when parents tell me I have an anxious child, that those transitions seem to be even harder for those children. Do you see that that's a trend?
Yeah, transitions are super hard. They get easier as you build these skills. And that's why I talk about being proactive and really, you know, not having the wait and see approach for an anxious predisposition. You have to wait for a diagnosis or wait for like go to the DSM and see if they're meeting these criteria. It's like any child who's having these anxious qualities, or even a child who's having a hard time with transitions and you don't think they're going to be anxious. there are things that we can do to build their skills. And transitions are a hard one for toddlers and preschoolers, and that's developmentally appropriate. But they don't necessarily grow out of it as they get older if they're anxious. And so we can do things to help them. And some of them are things that maybe are counterintuitive. So we know, okay, we're going to count down, okay, well, the literal countdown's very anxiety provoking. So if you have an anxious child, you will see them freak out if you start being like 5, 4, 3. That does not go well. And so that's very anxiety producing. And so that's a parenting approach that works for a lot of typical kids. I wouldn't recommend that for anxious kids. But the slow roll, we've got 15 more minutes or 10 more minutes. Toddlers don't get time. And so you have to anchor it in activities. We're going to eat lunch, and then we're going to wipe your face, and then we're going to get your shoes on, and then we're going to go. And so you actually need to anchor it in activities and not time, until they're much older. The other thing is anxious kids get often, I say often because they're all different, but they can get consumed with whatever activity they're in. And so if they're building Legos, they are in the middle of a tower, and they don't care that they're on a play date and you have a doctor's appointment to go to. They need to get that red one at the very top. And then you say, I've already told you that it's time to go. I already gave you the warnings. This is your third warning. That you're setting your child up for failure, even without recognizing that. And so when you have an anxious child or anxious predisposition, you kind of have to like watch what they're doing. And it's a little bit more work, but I always think, okay, I'm going to front load the work, but I'm not going to have to like carry my child out kicking and screaming. So I'm going to save 10 minutes on the back end. So if I'm watching my child, and I'm just going to use the Lego example, and I see that they're building a Lego, and I know my Johnny, he's going to want to finish that, then I'm going to maybe go in there 20 minutes earlier and say, we have to go. We're going to go in a few minutes. Can I help you build this? Or can we put it maybe on their shelf? And I'm going to resolve that for him. So whether I help him and speed the process up or help him close that activity down, that can really help. And then we kind of want, this is going to sound really weird, but we kind of want another activity before we leave. And so we want to shut down that activity. And then I want to redirect them to put their shoes on or to go get their coat or go do something else before I say we're going. Because that transition helps soften it to the car.
Oh, interesting. So you add a step in there.
Yeah, I want to disengage them with whatever activity they're in. So if they're baking cookies with their friend, I don't want to go from we're at the kitchen baking to I'm getting you into the car. I'm going to want to disengage you. I know that sounds really weird. I don't know why I'm saying that, but I can't think of a normal word. I want to disengage them from that activity fully. I want to unhook them before I tell them it's time to go, because now their brain is not in the middle of that task. Anxious kids have a hard time ending something because they want to finish it completely. And we tend to not recognize that. And so then they're caught off guard, then they feel pressured and they're trying to hurry and do something. And so we want to fully disengage them, even if it's not an activity. Let's say it's like they're watching TV with their friend. I want to get them off of the TV show. And so I might say, it's going to be time to go. Let's turn the TV off. I'm not saying we're going to the car yet, but I'm saying it like, oh, did you see their dog? Let's go say goodbye to the dog. Let's go kiss the dog's face. And so I'm removing them from whatever they were engaged into. And I'm supervising what the next phase will be before I leave. It sounds more technical, but it's actually like pretty simple.
Yeah, and you had mentioned earlier about them not having a great concept of time and that you really want to anchor it in this is happening, then this is happening, and then this is happening. And I definitely had to do that for my daughter for years. She almost had to know from the moment she woke up to the moment she went to bed what's happening next, and then what's going to happen, and then what's going to happen. And now she does not have this issue, but for years it felt like if something came up that either I had forgotten to mention. I remember once someone rang the doorbell unexpectedly. That was like too much. The doorbell rang because we had not talked about the doorbell ringing or someone stopping by the house. And so I'm curious if you have tips. Well, it sounds like you would recommend helping kids know what's coming next and that you think that's a positive way to address it. And so you can touch on that. And then I'm also curious if you have tips when things don't go, something comes up, randomly comes up, or you forgot to tell them one of the steps.
Yeah, parenting an anxious child is a tightrope. because we want to help them, especially in toddlerhood and preschoolhood, because I don't know if preschoolhood's a word, but I just made it up. Because we want, they're young. And so what we do for a toddler who's anxious is very different than what I would do for a 6-year-old who's anxious versus even a 10-year-old or 18-year-old who's anxious. And so it's developmentally appropriate to let a toddler know this is going to happen, then this is going to happen. And even when they're older, we're giving them some highlights. I mean, my kids are now 10, 12, and 18. My 10 and 12-year-old, and this is partly just habit at this point, but it helps. I give them the broad strokes of the day. Every time we drive to school, this actually happened this morning. I'm driving and I say, okay, I'm going to be interviewed, at dinner time. So we're going to get sushi. We just had sushi. And then we are going to be doing this. And so I'm giving them the broad strokes, but we do want to pull back and teach resilience, and we want to teach adaptability. And that's equally important. And so we don't want to over accommodate our anxious kids, because the world isn't going to over accommodate. Things do happen, and we want to teach that resiliency. And so actually a lot of the work I do with anxious kids, even toddlers, is shaking things up. So um, if I always go home after I pick them up from preschool, I might go to the grocery store sometimes. And if they freak out and say, you have to make a left, not a right. Or I've actually worked with anxious toddlers who actually tell you how to go. You have to go left, mommy. No, we go left, mommy. And a lot of times as parents, we don't realize that accommodating that kind of behavior, because we'll say, that's not that big of a deal. I can go left instead of right. It's better than the tantrum that's going to ensue. But I'm teaching that child that they can't handle discomfort. And so I want to say something like, I know that, and I talk about personifying anxiety. I know that your worry cloud is making you feel worried that if we go left, it's scary, but mommy's going to go right today. And so, yeah, teaching them some unpredictability in your schedule is helpful.
So all of that resonates with me. The drive, oh, I'm like, you're bringing flashbacks. The driving was a big thing for us. So she definitely would wanted to dictate exactly how we got somewhere. And so what in those examples, when you do something different and then the meltdown ensues, can you give an example of some language that you could use, or do you just let it unfold?
I really think it's helpful to label worry feelings, especially if you are seeing some red flags and it runs in your family. I do feel like giving that foundational language. And so, one of my favorite books is Andy Green's Worry Bug. Have you ever heard of it?
No.
I love it because it's super simple. Because there are books for kids like 6 to 8, that are considered very young books for anxiety, but there's nothing for like toddlers or like preschoolers. Um, Don't Feed the Worry Bug by Andy Green is my favorite, because that analogy, I don't know about the bug part because I've had kids who are afraid of bugs, but in my house, we called it the worry cloud. So I don't really like to personify it like it's a bug or a monster or your brain, the worry brain. I don't like that, just because I think a toddler can't understand that, and that can actually become kind of scary. But we want to talk about worries. So like in my house, like with my first daughter, it was the worry cloud. The worry cloud's going to come and give you that weird feeling in your tummy. And the worry cloud's going to say, mommy has to go left and she can't go right. And so then when I go left, instead of right, I do whatever my child doesn't want me to do. um, One of my mantras when I'm raising my anxious kids and in my practice is, you get to control you, but you don't get to control me. Or your worry cloud can control you if you want it to, but it doesn't get to tell me what to do. And so that really helps. You're building a foundation of the language that you're going to use literally until they're 18, 19. I still talk this way with my 18-year-old. I just use different language now, but the foundation was there at 2 and 3. And so I would say, I know the worry cloud wants me to go left, but tell your worry cloud that we're going to be fine if we go right. And sometimes the worry cloud doesn't get to choose. And so that's the language. So we're separating out their identity from the anxiety. So I'm not saying you don't tell me what to do or you don't get to choose. I'm saying the worry cloud is worried about this and the worry cloud doesn't get to choose.
That's awesome. Yeah, I definitely was guilty of over prepping my daughter. So when we did get her evaluated, they did coach me on that because she was at that point 4. And they said, all right, we want to ease off of that because her whole life cannot be scripted and things are going to come up. And she does so well now, but it did take some coaching and practice on my end to ease up and get comfortable that we were going to have some meltdowns when the unexpected happened. But she's better off for it, for sure.
Yeah, I mean, it definitely builds resiliency, and you do it in a very intentional way. So you don't do it randomly, like, I'm going to just freak my child out today. And we're going to go off script and we're going to just do left instead of right. And it's very intentional. And so you might say something like, I'm going to pick you up and then we're going to go for a surprise. So that anticipation of, I don't know what that is. Or being cognizant of when the anxiety is bossing you around, that you don't acquiesce to that, because that's actually teaching the anxiety that the anxiety can grow. When I'm feeling anxious, my mom doesn't think I can handle the discomfort. Not that that's true, but that's the message that's received. And so I'm going to tell my mom and she will adapt it for me. And it does take some time, and it does include a lot of meltdowns. And I think that's the hard part, is we have to tap into our own childhood and our own narrative of what we're telling ourselves when our children are crying and having meltdowns, especially with anxious kids, because if we can't tolerate it, because to us it equals poor parenting, or my child won't love me, or my child can't be any other emotion other than happy. That's our work, and we all have work to do, each and every one of us. We have to answer those questions. What is that about? Because it's not about our child.
Totally. Yeah, and I think, I have anxiety that not debilitating anxiety to the point where I can look back and remember it, but you and I have talked about this before, but I've always had this needle anxiety, and when I was a kid, I would faint. And so I had some real anxiety around that, and I have found, and I definitely see it with my daughter, and they confirmed it when they saw her, they said, "Thank goodness you have her sleeping so well, or she would be off the charts anxious." And I find it with myself that if I don't sleep well, I'll start to worry about things that a well-rested me would not worry about. And so I'm curious your thoughts and how you incorporate it into your teaching the importance of sleep and how you feel it plays into children's ability to help manage their anxiety.
Sleep and anxiety are very intermingled, because not only the obvious stuff, but melatonin levels are decreased in a lot of anxious brains. And new research actually just came out to really solidify that. It's like, to me, it's like, well, yeah, but it's nice to get the research to back that no wonder why a lot of our kids are really struggling just on a physiological level. But then separate from that, uh, the brain, when it's quiet, has an arena to torment you. Even in toddlerhood, a lot of times parents will say, what does a 2-year-old or 3-year-old have to worry about? Well, I don't have to worry about shark. I don't have to have had experience with sharks to be afraid of sharks. Whatever your imagination can do. And so that quiet, that dark time, that separation, all of that stuff, processing the day even at a young age, creates anxiety. And so not only do you have to develop good sleep habits, which is your world, but you have to address the core fears of what is causing that anxiety in order for them to not be hypervigilant, have their cortisol pumping, their adrenaline's pumping. There's no way they're going to be able to go to sleep when they're in that fight or flight mode.
Yeah, and on that topic, and you mentioned the sharks, we found that with my daughter, and this is actually still true, but now we've educated her and she can totally self-identify, but we had to really be careful about what she watched or even books that we read. So she has a very, very active imagination, which I'm curious your thoughts on that. With children, with anxiety, if they're more likely to have a very active imagination, but she was very sensitive to I remember Frozen, for example, when she was probably a toddler, very little, she would call it the scary monster movie all over that one big snowman that's in there for about 2 minutes and he throws them out of a castle. And so that's all she gravitated to. And so since then she still doesn't like to watch a lot of movies. And so I think to protect her imagination and anxiety, we had to really be careful about what she was exposed to really when she was little. And now she kind of identifies. She could start watching something and say, no, this isn't for me. I have to step out. But do you find that that is also important with the more anxious kids?
Yeah, they're very sensitive to what they a lot of them are sensitive to what they watch. And I mean, Aquanauts was scary for my kids. You know, couldn't watch Aquanauts. I'm like, what is scary about that? But when I watched it, I saw like it's just those little snippets or things that are overwhelming. And because they can often read people better and really tune into those emotions and a slightly raised voice is a huge shout, right? Why are you shouting at me? Why are you yelling at me? And you're like, I am just using a firm tone. They can see that and sense that, and those stories come alive because a lot of times they do have a bigger imagination and they have a bigger heart, and so they empathize and over identify with the characters. And so to them, and especially in toddlerhood and preschool, their fantasy and their reality is blurred, and so to them, they don't know I'm just watching a cartoon. They're so immersed into it that that can be traumatizing. And so I don't think it's over accommodating to teach them, how to protect their brain. And actually, it's a conversation that you start to have as they get older. And what you notice in toddlerhood, you start to back off from as the kids get older, and you want them to start to do it themselves. And it's funny because my now 10-year-old was like that growing up, super sensitive. She can feel everyone's emotions, everything we're talking about. And I can't remember what it was. I wish I remembered what it was. She's 10 now, so she wanted to watch this thing, and she was like, Mom, I can handle it. It's not a big deal. And I was like, you have a very sensitive, you know, file in your head, and it'll play over and over. But if you think you're fine, and she had nightmares all night, and then she woke up the next morning. She goes, you know what? From now on, I'm going to protect my brain. I'm not going to watch things like that. But she needed to decide that at that point. And so it's an evolution.
Totally. And I do think my daughter's also very empathetic. And for example, Disney movies, someone always dies, some parent always dies, and so she will tell you proactively, I don't like any Disney movies because she always ends up crying. So
Yeah.
either they scare her
Yeah.
and or something happens and she just feels it so deeply that she has a hard time bouncing back from it.
Hmm.
All the
Yeah.
emotions.
Yeah. And those again become the kids' superpowers because it's their ability to tune into people's feelings and to be so incredibly empathetic. Um, and that's what I tell, anxious kids as they get older, that those things are beautiful and you just have to learn how to protect yourself. And it's a gift if you know how to take the good parts and throw out the bad.
Absolutely. So, what would be your top tips for parents who have toddlers or early preschool who feel like they identify that their child is anxious? What is your kind of go-to advice?
Well, the first thing is kind of what we talked about already, which is definitely labeling their emotion, and saying you have to talk for them. I'm scared. I know that seems really simplistic, but that is huge. And then the second thing is you really want to stack your involvement with whatever it is that they can't do. And so there's a tendency for us to swoop in and over coddle or over accommodate an anxious toddler because they're having an even harder time. And so it's very counterintuitive to do as little as you can for them and start to move backwards. Just like when you're teaching someone to tie their shoes, you start with it fully tied and then you just have them do that last loop and then you move backwards until eventually they're fully tying their shoe. It's the exact same thing with anxiety. And I'll give you a concrete example because I'm all about concrete examples. My youngest, the one I was just talking about, she could not poop by herself, which is a very common toddler thing. But her level of anxiety, she's got like toileting themes, even now that I think of it, but like more 10-year-old stuff. But she could not go in the bathroom alone. And a lot of times constipation is kind of a side dish to toddler anxiety, and because they just slow down their whole system, and so they have painful poops and then they become afraid of pooping, and so toileting becomes a big issue for anxious toddlers. And she had all that going on. She was constipated and she was anxious, and so I had to like hold her hand. We weren't just going into the bathroom. I would have to get a stool and have to sit and hold her hand while she pooped, and she would sweat and she'd feel really anxious, and then that would be that. So that's the most extreme. Being aware of that, Eventually, she would have to go poop, and then I'd sit outside the door frame. And then eventually, I would sit where she couldn't see me, but she could hear me. And then eventually, I got to the couch. That's not intuitive parenting to edge our way. We think of that with when we think of possibly sleep, but we don't think of that with other stuff like basic things. And that could really be literally anything. You need to hold me while I say hi to somebody. You need to speak for me. And so we just want to like inchworm our way backwards and always saying, what can I do to empower my child and let them know without scaring them or throwing them in the deep end that they've got this and that I believe in them.
And did you do that in a regimented way, as in, so sometimes in sleep, we'll say, "Okay, I'm gonna sit here for 3 days, and then I'm gonna move the chair a little bit and sit over here for 3 days," or were you reading her and realizing, like, "Okay, I think she's ready, I'm gonna take the next step." So do you take a regimented approach, or are you kind of reading the situation?
You're reading the child. I don't want that sheer panic look in their face, but I want a little discomfort. Same thing when she had to go to swim class. Initially walked her all the way in and had to sit next to the pool, right? I mean, how many? It's like these are the common issues with anxious toddlers. And then eventually I would be behind the glass, and then eventually I was in the seat. And so you're gauging your child's level of panic, and hopefully as a parent that deer caught in headlights, this isn't going to work, I'm hyperventilating look versus I'm a little uncomfortable. I'm referencing you. I'm looking back at you a couple of times, um, but I'm doing it. The wrap up is really important too.
That's what I was gonna ask about is, so what do you say when they do it? Are you congratulating them, or are you just kind of letting it go?
Now, the wrap up is so important. And that's the part I think a lot of parents forget too, is you just had this great learning lesson for the child and then you leave it on the table. You don't put a bow on it. So I'll give you like a concrete example as well with swim class. So she couldn't jump into the water forever because she thought that she was just going to sink to the bottom and the coach wasn't going to catch her. And so, we inchwormed and then she did it. And so on the car ride back home, I like to use like a narrative story approach. And so instead of saying, "Mommy's so proud of you, you were so brave," I know that's like an intuitive thing to say, but then it's about me. You made me proud when you fought your anxiety. And it's really not that you're going to break your child if you use that language, but it's better. And a lot of times I'll say, "I'm so proud of you." And then I'll switch and I'll be like, I mean, you should be so proud of yourself. But with toddlers, I love using stories. So I would say, once upon a time, there was a little girl, and she knows what I'm doing because I would do this a lot. And I would say, and she was so scared to jump off, the side. She thought she would sink to the bottom or her coach wouldn't catch her. And so I would kind of recap all of the things. But one day, and I build it up with excitement and I go, and then, normally my toddler would be like, "Say it, mommy, say it," and I'm like, "She jumped in," and she was so proud of herself. And so telling it in a story mode, even, um, my daughter would get used to that and would like it. And she would be like, "Tell me," and we'd be driving to some class and she'd say, "Tell me the story again, mom." And so it was part of her building her skills.
So she would wanna hear it on the way to class as to get ready as well?
It was therapeutic. Yeah. So she would want to hear it as she was preparing because unlike adults where we would give ourselves positive talk, you know, kids have an imagination and it's fantasy based. So telling her the story again was empowering her and giving her that like pep talk that she can do it.
That's awesome. Yes, we had swim issues at our house too. That actually is something I do remember as a child of being scared of getting in the water and getting the old-fashioned heave ho, like, "I'm just gonna
Yeah.
throw you in," and I did not do that to my kids. I really and I'm so glad because 'cause they're both very passionate swimmers now, and to
Uh,
this day, I can definitely swim, but I don't love the water,
it
and I
does
think
ruin
it's from
it.
those early, like, "Toss 'em in."
That just doesn't work. I mean, even if they wind up swimming, you're kind of my oldest will never eat broccoli again because my husband was just like, we're gonna go head to head with broccoli. And like even to this day, she will not eat broccoli. And she was eating broccoli as long as it had cheese on it, and now she won't touch it. So I do think when you get into power struggles, or you like forcefully make them do stuff, yeah, they might do it, but long term, what's the message?
Exactly. Alright, any other big tips or things that you want people to take away?
I think identifying and like naming it, like a worry cloud, or reading a toddler book about anxiety, and then being proactive, build those skills early. As soon as they come out of my womb, I start working with them. I'm like, had another child, let's work on this. And regardless of whether they get full-blown anxiety later, these are skills that will make any child resilient.
All right, I have one last question on that very topic. Are there things that we can do during toddlerhood that could help our children not get full-blown anxiety? Do you think all these things that we just talked about help that, or that's kind of an inevitable thing if that's what they're predisposed to?
I don't think it's inevitable to what severity your child's going to get anxiety. I feel like that's the environmental piece that we get to impact. And so when I see parents working on creating resilience, not over accommodating the anxiety, empowering the child to face their fears, giving them language, making them feel heard, they do better and their prognosis is better. And they may not have full blown anxiety. I mean, I think about my kids and I think, oh my gosh, like what would you look like? Because all three of them have had, actually, my 18-year-old's doing fantastic. But I'm like, what would this look like without you like living with an anxiety and OCD therapist? But they're doing great. I mean, they're functioning, and we have the power to do that. That's our role.
Yes, I feel that way even about the help I got with my daughter just to get the tools. I'm all about tools. So when
Yeah,
someone gives me the tools, it's very empowering to take
yeah.
that step and to help them. Awesome. Well, thank you so much for joining me. And I would love for you to share where everyone can find you. And I know you're offering a free series right now. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Twice a year, I do a free series called Survival Tools for Parents who are raising kids with anxiety or OCD. And it's a 3-part video series, but there's there's a series website. So you can just watch the videos during the series whenever you have time during the series opening. And I'm also actually doing live classes about each video in a Facebook group for the series. And so some parents are diving in really deep and they're getting my expertise for that concentrated time. And it's for parents of all ages. So we have got parents in this series who are raising toddlers, and we have parents who are raising 18-year-olds. So it's a nice range that we can all learn from each other. And people can sign up for the series at atparentingsurvivalseries.com.
Perfect. And is there a place that they can find you on social media?
They can find me in Facebook at facebook.com/AT Parenting Survival. I'll have to look that up. Find me on Instagram at AT Parenting Survival.
Perfect.
Yeah.
Awesome. Well, thanks so much. And I will link in the show notes to all the places to find you and to the series. And I'm sure people will be headed your way because I get lots of questions on this topic.
Well, I appreciate it. Thanks for having me.
All right. Bye for now. Thank you for listening to How Long Till Bedtime. To learn how we can work together to improve your child's sleep, please visit sleepandwellnesscoach.com.